Yes, I'll just quickly take a minute to set the ball rolling. Because this was something, and with this, I'll request Mr. Adel maybe to begin. I was just going through, just curious. I was going through this definition of, they're terming it as an interim government because we know the background. I'm not directly directly hitting the main issue. I'm not going into what the protests and all of this we know. Now, I was just little curious because this definition of interim government, and I was reading the Constitution of Bangladesh out of curiosity. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And I found out that there was one 13th amendment to the Constitution of Bangladesh, which kind of differentiates between caretaker government and interim government. And this was passed in 1996. Now, this amendment added another chapter, chapter 2A, which says non-party caretaker government. This was part 4 of the Bangladesh constitution, where the elections will be conducted under the caretaker system. But then later on in 2011, it was abolished. Now my question with which we should begin, and let's suppose as an interim government, how do you delineate the powers of this interim government? What is the focus in this situation where there is a geopolitical turmoil? How does this interim government tackle the issue? There is a foreign policy challenge. There are border issues. Then there are internal challenges. There is a regional challenge, and on top of it, you have all the macroeconomic problems in terms of inflation. There's a serious issue of inflation. I've been closely working with. There's a network, South Asian Association of Economic Modeling, SANEM, and I have been to Bangladesh multiple times. In fact, I was I uh, came across one of my blog posts in Sanem blog that I wrote almost a year back, where I was talking about how India-Bangladesh relations have developed. Now, I was reading that blog again today, and I felt that maybe I should rewrite that blog after we have that discussion, and maybe again revisit to what I wrote. So open to the floor, and we'll start with Mr. Adel. Can you pitch in with the first 2 points?
Yeah, sure. So I think just to give it like a very short, not a history lesson, but I think like just a context of like where we are. So the two portions of the constitutional changes that you mentioned. So even before I think like 1991, what used to happen was like we also had like a military rule. Beyond that, we went into like a democratic process. So what the general expectation ended up being is we should try to make sure that the election that happens should happen in a way so that there is no like undue influence on the election process itself. So that's why like the first change that you mentioned in 96. So that was the first democratic election that happened after the military regime was brought down. So that's when the caretaker government was introduced. So like for 3 months, they would be in power. And what they would do is make sure that the country gets rolling, but also the election and like all the processes are happening without having a political party-led ruling government in power. Then on what ended up happening was like there was a general indication that the political ruling party was using their opportunity of making sure that the caretaker government or the interim government that is going to be there are also aligned with their political ideas, just so that they can also get the election process happening in their own way. So that's when we ended up having the issues that we saw in like 2006, 2008, where like one of the interim governments that was introduced also went for a martial law. So that interim government stayed in power for around like 2 years, and then the election happened, and that's when we saw the modification that you mentioned, that like the interim government was like taken away constitutionally. So the main issue that was initially happening was that the political parties most likely have an opportunity of like misusing the scope that is given in the constitution. But what I would personally say that the fundamental difference that we are seeing right now is necessarily think that the interim government that we currently have had any like political backing or like any reason for that to be there. So what we're currently getting is like there was a lot of negotiation that happened between the politically active people, but also the general population even like some of the leaders of the student protests that happened were also part of the negotiation. So what we ended up having is like a quite a well-rounded group of people, which we think are like quite capable in their own fields. So like we have seen like people who are considered like quite generally to be like not politically aligned in any of the ways, but also like are quite capable in their own field that they have. So so that also gives us a general expectation. I think the connecting with the other follow-up question that you have about like what's going to happen with them. So about the policy and like other things, even in the past when the interim governments or the caretaker governments were there, what they used to become is like basically the de facto ministers of the different ministries that we have. So the general functioning of the processes would happen as it is. So they have the generally like the full power of taking ministry level decisions. So be it like international relations, economics, or like even like internal affairs, and like also like other different like factors that you would have to like focus on. So all of these things are happening. So like for example, the secretariat was not abolished, the court wasn't necessarily abolished, so all those other functions are also there. But what we're expecting from this interim government is to like stay neutral enough to the point that they take decisions which are supposed to be taken in the welfare of the general population. So even from that perspective, we think like yes, they have unfortunately received a country which has like some problems which are connected to how the country was run in the last like 10-15 years. So yes, they do have certain challenges, but we do think like contrary to other like political situations where the ministries were handed over to people because of their political loyalty or like the allegiances that they showed, the people that are currently in like in control of like different ministries are capable enough because they have like had a long career in mostly like administrating the things that they're currently given responsibility for. So people who are in like law is a law faculty of Dhaka University. People who are like in charge of like health, like women and like healthcare are like from the background, like they have been working in the development sector, focusing on education, like other specific elements. So in like connection to that, we do feel like they would be able to make sure that like certain decisions are taken that are neutral enough, for which like I don't think like international partners of the country should be feeling very skeptical about like how this is being done. I do generally hope that the decisions that they're going to take are going to be actually like much more beneficial, because it's not going to like cut corners into going through partnerships. It's most likely going to ensure a lot of things are considered for both sides, and like a win-win situation becomes available for like all parties that are involved there. So yeah, like quite optimistic, considering it's quite different from whatever that we have seen in recent past, and also like they are quite capable. So yeah, looking forward to what happens.
Thank you. Now, in these lines, may I request Ahmed if you can come up with what do you think in terms of how we started the discussion, and then what might be the ramifications for India? Like we are here, and how the foreign policy of that's a kind of a cause of worry for a country which shares a major chunk of the border with Bangladesh, and then how investments in terms of mm, uh, the relations that we have in terms of India and Bangladesh, how that might kind of span out in the days to come, and then in those lines I'll ask Orgho to respond. Yes, Hamid, over to you.
Very good evening. So, am I audible? Okay. Now, I think from India's perspective, initially there was actually a lot of skepticism. Okay. And the reason why I say that is because the departure of Sheikh Hasina was initially considered to be the worst case scenario for India from a foreign policy perspective. Now, you see, the thing is that our relations with Bangladesh are not just about economic ties or cultural ties, something. It's a historical civilizational relationship that we have. And to that perspective, we've actually managed to integrate the relationship with Bangladesh quite a lot, and specifically in the past 15 years, which is why it was so, which is why in India, there's actually a lot of discussion happening on the future of Bangladesh. Having said that, I think one of the things that we need to be very careful about, or what we are going to look at, is actually a very, in a few perspectives, are going to be firstly about the security point of view. Okay. Now, India's longest border is actually with Bangladesh. We have around, I think, 4,096 kilometers of international border with Bangladesh. And 5 states of ours are sharing a boundary with Bangladesh. And specifically amongst them, West Bengal and Assam have seen a lot of debate around infiltration from Bangladesh that has taken place. So, firstly, I think from a security perspective, we have to look at how Bangladesh is managing to stabilize itself. And to that end, I think the first thing that we need to understand with what has happened in Bangladesh is that this is not a military coup. This is a civilian uprising. And once there is a civilian uprising, you have to understand that the situation within Bangladesh was such that the people could no longer take the rule of the regime of Sheikh Hasina. And that is a very important differentiation from the perspective of South Asian politics, if you look at it. Because previously, before 91, you had military coups in Bangladesh. But this is a civilian uprising. So the people of Bangladesh have risen in revolt against Sheikh Hasina, and that important differentiation, I believe, has to be given due regard in this. Coming to that, I think firstly the security perspective. You come to think of it right now, one of the major concerns in India has been the attacks on the minorities that have taken place in Bangladesh, specifically the Hindu community. And to that end, let me give credit to the new interim government that has come in. And to the student leaders also, where Professor Yunus has actually spoken about that he would resign if the attacks on Hindus continue. And there are student leaders who've given out a sort of fresh perspective that they cannot be attacks on Hindus because they too are a part of Bangladeshi society. So to that end, they are trying to take steps to stabilize it. But the picture that we are getting currently is grim. Secondly, there are views that are going around that within Bangladesh, there is internal turmoil in the sense that the police force is not reporting on duty. And the student leaders in parts of Bangladesh have to take up policing duties because of the police fears that because they acted on behalf of Sheikh Hasina, there might be retribution from society. So to that end, right now, you do not have a properly functioning police force, right? I know it's been just a week since Sheikh Hasina left, but these are things that we are looking at from an Indian perspective. Because internal turmoil is going to have a direct ramification on the international border. The reason why we are scared is because particularly from 2001 to 2006, when Khaleda Zia was the prime minister, unfortunately, there was a view that Bangladesh was becoming a safe haven for anti-India elements. And this is something which I think after Fakhruddin Ahmed took charge in 2006 when martial law was introduced, from that end onwards and after Sheikh Hasina came back, they were trying to control that to a large end. And to that degree, let's say that now we had stability on that end. Like Bangladesh was no longer becoming a safe haven for anti-India elements. So that is something which is very critical for us that even if whenever elections take place in Bangladesh and whichever party comes to power, we just hope that it does not become a safe haven for anti-India elements again. And I think that we have room for cautious optimism right now because I truly believe that this is an aspirational Bangladeshi society because the students have taken the leadership of it. And whichever government comes to power, they cannot ignore these elements and they have to take that forward because of the linkages that we enjoy. Secondly, let us look at the economic perspective. You see, one of the things that this movement has proved of sorts is that economics alone cannot determine the future of a country, and democratic process is equally important. So, to that end, I think the Sheikh Hasina regime's insistence on not having a free and fair election was a large cause of this because the suppressed emotion of the people has come out through this entire movement. And that is something which we are, come to think of it, that is critical for South Asian politics. So before I come to the economic aspect, you look at India's neighborhood currently, each and every nation that is surrounding India, with the exception of Bhutan, is currently facing internal turmoil. Be it Sri Lanka, you had a civilian uprising there. Be it Pakistan right now, where, the army versus Imran Khan, there is constant conflict going on. Then you look at China, which is constantly trying to harbor anti-India elements as well as also trying to get countries in the form of the debt trap diplomacy, right? Which is also what we fear for Bangladesh. I'll just come to that right now with that debt trap diplomacy. And then you talk of Myanmar, which has a military over there right now, that there is no civilian government. In Nepal, you've got a prime minister who's changing every year. And Bangladesh, up till now, was considered to be largely stable from an Indian perspective. Like, we obviously did not get involved with the internal politics of Bangladesh, but it was coming across that Sheikh Hasina has things under control. But the moment you had the 2024 election where people were not allowed to exercise their franchise, it actually became only a matter of time till the suppressed emotion of the people came out. And the civilian uprising is just a continuation of democratic process is not being given due regard. Now, with that, let me come to the economic aspect in specificity. Now, I will tell you why Bangladesh is important. It's important for the Bay of Bengal region. No Bay of Bengal region policy can take place without Bangladesh being at the center of it. The BIMSTEC headquarters are in Dhaka. And India's entire perspective around the Bay of Bengal region and South Asia's perspective towards the Bay of Bengal region revolves around a stable Bangladesh. And if I were to extrapolate that, yesterday Sheikh Hasina gave a statement about the Saint Martin Island. Okay, the Saint Martin Island near the Cox's Bazar is something which they say that America is eyeing. And to that end, let me extrapolate that to the Indo-Pacific regional stability as well. So if I were to come on economics, so you see in India, the northeastern region with the Agartala-Akhura rail link that was signed between India and Bangladesh, that became critical for the northeastern region stability for India. Secondly, the Chattogram port India was given access to the Chattogram port for it becoming a transit port for India. So you had that being critical to India's interest. Then you had the Siliguri-Parvatipur friendship pipeline. And these were, projects in India and Bangladesh were taking off from the economic perspective. Bangladesh was being looked at as an economic tiger, like an upcoming tiger. And I still believe that despite the turmoil, you have Professor Yunus in charge right now. And you have a fairly good cabinet that has taken charge for an interim period. I do think that with the aspirational society that Bangladesh is coming into, once stability is restored within Bangladesh, I still think that Bangladesh is going to continue or maybe even grow further because the people of Bangladesh need jobs. They realize that economic integration is important. They realize that development is important. And that is what I said. We have to recognize the difference between a civilian uprising as well as like a military coup. With a civilian uprising, you know that the citizens want what is best for them. So I still think that once stability is restored, the economic progress of Bangladesh will not be hampered. But to that end, you need to restore stability. You need to stop the attacks on minorities. You need the police force to come back in. You need a proper administrative framework to come into power again. And economic perspective, like when I talk about the debt trap diplomacy. So one of the things that we fear is that, in December, the India Out campaign had sort of taken center stage in Bangladesh, which was fueled by the BNP and the Jamaat-e-Islami. And now, whenever a government does take place, if let's say a BNP government does come to power, what our fear is that the India Out campaign might take center stage, like what was happening in Maldives until recently. And you might have China actually coming out. See, China is the money bags of this region. There's nothing to deny that. China would actually come and take a leading role over here and actually sort of bring Bangladesh within to its debt trap diplomacy, where it pushes in so much money into the region and the country cannot repay its loan, and so it has to start leasing out its strategic assets. A simple example is Sri Lanka and the Hambantota port, right? Hambantota port had to be given for 99-year lease to a Chinese company because they were not being able to repay the loan. So and that is why we believe that we will obviously be looking at Bangladesh from this perspective very closely. But like I said, I think there is room for cautious optimism because you have student leaders taking charge. It's an aspirational society. And yeah, India and Bangladesh now have very, very close historical, civilizational, economic, and cultural ties. And I do believe that once the student leaders come in, we'll be able to harness that. And I know, I think one mistake that we have to acknowledge as Indians is that we should not have got identified with Sheikh Hasina in a political way. Like people started believing that India means Sheikh Hasina. That should not have been the case, and that was not the case. So I do believe that India is now very open to engagement with any government. The new government has already given a statement that they'll have balance of relations with India. It will not be like India, like Bangladesh will become a anti-India society. So we have room for cautious optimism. So I'm looking at it from that perspective, to be very honest.
Thank you, Ahmed. Now, moving on, I would request Orgo if you can respond in this line with regards to what should be the growth story of Bangladesh in the coming years? Which sectors should Bangladesh target in particular? And then, if you can add in points, since you are based, if I'm not wrong, in Canada, right? Orgo, you are in Canada, right? Yes. So, how is the feeling being a Bangladeshi outside Bangladesh? What is the feeling in terms of what is the situation there? How do people kind of think about Bangladesh, or like we ask people when we meet them who are Indians, NRI. So what is the sentiment about India abroad? So if I may ask you in that line, if you can respond to these issues, that first is the growth story, and then what is the feeling about Bangladesh in abroad, not only in Canada but in other cases, since you are visiting other places in around there. Yes, over to you.
Right. So thank you so much. I hope I'm clearly audible to everyone. Okay, so if I try to speak of in context of someone who has not been in the country for the last 5 years and has shifted to a different country, the last 2 weeks had been quite daunting, if not anything else, especially given like my parents and my in-laws, they are all age and they all live in Bangladesh. And being disconnected from them for quite an expansive amount of time was nothing less than agonizingly painful because the feeling of helplessness is something that you cannot really explain in words. And being from a minority community, even though I was always privileged to be around a community that has not always given me the feeling that I'm a minority, but the incidents or the events that have happened since my birth is something that cannot be really denied. And I really commend, Ahmed explaining that fact that yes, there have been multiple, incidents on not only minorities or even it's a political individuals who were, affiliated with the, fallen regime. But under no circumstance, the flow of information is something that has been really painful for us because there is nothing that we can do other than getting to hear our parents' voice that they're okay or not. And when we were not allowed to have that opportunity, I cannot really explain how painful it must have been for not only myself, the others who were unable to communicate, because the internet or phone calls are the only ways how we can get to know whether our parents are safe or not. And when we were not able to do that, growth or economic prosperity, nothing of those actually mattered to us. And even at this point of time, when we are not certain that whether our parents are going to be in a good state or not, today, like today or in the next moment, is something that is again agonizingly painful. Adel is there in Bangladesh, so I'm pretty certain that he can vouch in and say that even he's sort of uncertain as to how things are going. Yes, there are aspirational aspects that the current interim government has put forward some steps or has given some glimpse of hope that can indicate that yes, they're trying to start towards a good time. But even at this point of moment, I think it's really critical for us to understand that there is an imminent threat or a risk factor that sort of is not allowing people to feel safe in their own homes. And when this is the situation, I think it's difficult for us to look forward to a stage of growth that we're going to aspire for. Yes, Bangladesh has developed in terms of becoming more economically prosperous, and it owes a lot towards the hard work and the labor force that we've been able to sort of accumulate over a period of time. So from Henry Kissinger saying that Bangladesh is the bottomless basket, from there becoming one of the biggest R&D sectors in Southeast Asia, I think is a testament to itself that yes, Bangladesh has the potential to become economically prosperous. But in the course of doing so, what this certain upheaval or the public uprising has indicated is people not being able to voice out what they really want. So the oppression that has been constantly ongoing is a result of the fallen regime. But that is in the past now. So how do we move forward from here? Yes, it is essential to gain the trust of the people because even from outside, I am not in a state where I can fully trust the people who are there in the country. So whenever I see different statements from different individuals in power at the moment, it is difficult for me individually and personally to believe because on multiple occasions, even in the past, there have been people who have come in and said aspirational words, but the extent to which they were fruitful or they were actually materialized is something that is questionable. So if you ask me that, do I see a bright future ahead? I want to see it, but the probability of it being materialized is something that is heavily questionable, at least in my mind. And I still do not have enough grounds to sort of make this claim that yes, people who have come to power will change the world. As I've learned in science, there is nothing called ideal, but I would want to see the light at the end of the tunnel. In terms of the growth factor, I think one of the critical aspects that needs to be taken into consideration is the flow of information, because the optics of what we get to know is something that is heavily questionable. And I am sorry to say that the media hasn't been the best agent to put forward this information because multiple agencies have put forward different information. Some have been even contradictory in nature. And whenever I get to hear three different stories about three different incidents, in 3 different channels, it again makes me question because I don't know. Then I have to call back home, and there also some of the sources are not as reliable and credible. But in the means of understanding or considering these incidents, I think we cannot really deny the fact that there haven't been incidents, because when we saw that after the 5th of August, when the leader fled the country, the degree to which there were certain incidents that happened, and those were not something we should be joyous about, because these are not acts that we want to put forward. And I also commend that, after 1 or 2 days, I think there were certain actions that were taken against people. They ended up returning those items that were chosen, they're taken away from Gana Bhavan. But again, the actions have taken, and the global media, or let's say people who are outside the country, they have seen how people have rejoiced taking away, personal items from those places, and it isn't a good optics in terms of a country. How it might jeopardize, or how it might sort of affect the political collaboration, I think that certain instances aren't a example of how the general people will be going about, and I don't want to take it as such as well. But for us to see it, that okay, how do we move forward, and how do we make it more prosperous, or how do we make sure that from the point that we have reached, how do we move forward? And for that to happen, I think it's important for these individuals to show certain degree of transparency, certain degree of accountability, because those were some of the critical elements that probably were not, showcased adequately by any of the past regimes. And that is, some of the questionable attributes that we even feel terrible about ourselves as well. Because at the age of 28, when I left the country, I did not get a single chance to vote till then. So that again is a clear indication of, how we perhaps were not able to voice or contribute towards the entire democratic process. Yes, Bangladesh is known to be a democratic country, but the actual practices of it is something that, again, the onus is on the interim government to showcase that yes, they would be able to execute it, because the individuals who have come to power or have been given the responsibility are all sort of credible individuals. They have their entire background to back it up, but then again, they are the figureheads. They have to sort of move on a vehicle that has wheels that are old, and how those wheels will function is something that I feel again would be a big challenge for them. But I don't see everything to be grim. I do see that, especially from the outer world, people who are from the Western countries, when we have seen, yes, the different ties, or let's say the collaboration between countries, let's say India and Bangladesh, yes, there are certain questions about it as well, that whether they would be able to collaborate, whether they would be able to sort of take different initiatives, because we cannot choose our neighbors. And whenever my house burn, the first person who will notice it is probably my neighbor. So if they are not collaborating, or if they're not sort of being empathetic towards each other, it will not be good for any of us, because neighbors are there to stay. They will not be going away unless you sort of put them away and make them flee. But I think in order for us to see the better future, stability is really important. And I think there are some, again, glimmer of hope. I think Adel is probably the best person to showcase to us or tell us that whether it is true or not, because I cannot trust any of the information that I get. And I'm sorry, when I'm saying this, that my trust has been broken so many times that I cannot really put my trust at stake, because I don't know the information that I'm getting is actually true or not. And in terms of the growth factor, yes, economic prosperity will probably come in because of the potential that has been showcased over a period of time. But for that to happen, I think people's trust is important. And whenever merit and credibility, because that is the initiating point for this entire uprising as well, that merit should be the primary factor for any opportunity being given. And quotas, in debates as well, we have this certain argument that in quotas or affirmative actions are required, but this should be given in a moderated way that ensure that ones who are essentially underprivileged, or ones who need a certain degree of support, are the ones who end up receiving it, not in a blanket way, simply trying to favor or show any form of um, optimism towards this individual, or being partial towards a certain community in order to favor your own needs. So in that circumstance, I feel that it's really uh, critical for Bangladesh at the moment, even after so many days of independence. It's said to be the second independence for our country. I hope that is the case. But for us to have that outlook from thousands of kilometers away from our homeland or my country of birth, it is important for these individuals to materialize and execute. It would be a difficult task, and as said, it's very volatile in terms of how things are going about and how we see how minorities are being persecuted. Yes, there is concession, and I really can commend that, because I think previously there was a case that no, nothing of this sort happens, but that acknowledgement is something that gives again some degree of hope to us that no, it's not entirely being denied, because being oblivious is not going to favor anyone whatsoever, but it is only going to give us some degree of hope that no, we are absolutely not abandoned. It is something that is given some degree of importance, and that is when the policies can come about. And support is also important, and for international support to be there, I think again the interim government, in terms of its going about, I think they are being transparent, they're being accountable, they are they're signposting their steps. And again, in debate, it's really important that you showcase and give an outline as to what you intend to do, and that will give people that hope and aspiration that how they want to go ahead. And then when it gets materialized, I'm sure that the interim government will be able to acquire more confidence and get the traction of the people as well.
Thank you, Arvo. Moving on, now may I invite Mubarak to kind of share his views on the last part of the story before I kind of open the house for policy challenges, our last point of discussion, the role of civil society, army, law and order. How do you think this combines in this situation that we have in Bangladesh, and the intersectionality of everything that the interim government has to focus on? And in fact, all our esteemed panelists have focused on that. Want your views on that, Mubarak? And how should the interim government take it forward before we kind of throw the house open for policy challenge?
In terms of civil society, I think the first and foremost, most obviously agreed with Orgway, is the focus of the interim government is obviously to get back peace and stability as fast as possible. There are some positive trends at the moment. Ahmed was talking about the police who have dropped their demands and have started coming back to work. We see instances, hearteningly, of even Jamaat Islam, which is the Islamic political party in Bangladesh, some of them actually going and doing security duty to protect temples as well. So there are some positive signs of some levels of de-escalation of the situation happening. So that's there. I think the bigger challenge is in terms of the military, I think we've all kind of been positively. The situation has been quite positive in the sense that the military has not tried to take power and has largely been seen to take a back seat. So in that way, they're very different from the Pakistani military. And the other thing is, but at the same time, I think there are difficulties in the sense that it's a very entrenched system. So you talk about, we are having issues with people who are sitting in the Bangladesh Bank, for example. You talk about the Chief Justice who was, forced to resign. Even if you look at the Awami League's entrenchment of people in positions of power runs very, very deep, because 15 years is a relatively long time. And whether you like to admit it or not, they have done their entrenchment much better than previous attempts of entrenchment by other political parties. Even to the point of, even if you look at defense officers housing society, right? So you have these housing societies given to military housing societies given to retired army and military officers. Even the presidents over there cannot be elected and have to be selected by the government, right? So it just basically runs that deep. Every single position is kind of selected by your allegiance to the former dictator. That essentially means that there is a lot of difficulty in removing that entrenchment. But of course, then comes the question of, do we let the interim government stay in power for long? They were not, elected constitutionally. It's supposed to be 3 months, but I think but political popularity-wise, I think there's a lot of support for them staying longer to ensure free and fair elections and a little bit of cleaning up of the system. I believe a couple of advisors have already come forward and said, they'll take the time they need. But I do think some level of clarity eventually needs to come forward as to what kind of timeline we're looking at. Because the longer this goes on, the more the mainstream political parties, particularly the BNP, will be putting a lot of pressure for elections to happen very, very fast, which will give less time for this cleansing process to happen. But the other point is also that people want a different political system, right? Not ones that is between the Army League and the BNP and Jamaat and Jatiya Party or whatever. People want fresh, potentially youth within the political system. But it's not easy. It's not easy to set up an established grassroots-based political party that can meaningfully challenge in an election and set it up countrywide when you're going. So if elections happen very fast, it's going to be very difficult to beat mainstream political parties. And then we will probably come back into the same, system of autocrats coming back to power just with different faces. So that's the challenge ahead of us, which is not easy to deal with. I have some comments about Indian reactions as well, but perhaps I'll wait for others to weigh in first and come back to it.
Okay, so I have one question which I feel before I go into the policy challenge part, and I felt these 2 points we can discuss before we go to the policy part. I'm just again curious. Maybe Adel can answer or Go can answer. I just kind of give it to the panel. But don't you think what started as a student movement eventually culminated as a lot of as a movement which was mainly against the corruption? It started as a quota movement, culminated into a movement which was against the authoritarian, the rule that was there, or maybe the corruptions. People were not allowed to exercise their right to democracy, etc., etc. This is number one. So don't you think the student movement lost its color, and there was some element of politics which came into that? I completely support the student movement and the way things worked out, what the government did, though none of us were, in fact, back in India, none of us were there when the situation unfolded. But then, what we have read, what we have seen, I strongly feel, though I'm not in a position to kind of vouch for that because I'm in India. But then, what I feel is that the color of the student movement might have become political. That is number one, to which I want the panel to respond. And number two is, do you think that there was some external political pressure? I think all are like Ahmed or Go, Bharat, they were mentioning that was there a China influence? Was there Pakistan influence? Maybe US, because this issue of St. Martin Islands that has cropped up. Was there some external role by any of these states in fueling up not the student movements? Please don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about the student movement. What unfolded as the second liberation after 1971? Don't you think that was kind of fueled up? Student movement got diluted, though the student players are in the picture very much, and there was some influence of these external states. Yes, I open it to the panel if whosoever wants to respond. I was kind of very curious that how do we look into this, and then we go into the policy challenges in an open forum. Yes.
Yeah, so I think like I'm just going to go first. Again, like just to give a context on like the history itself. So like one thing that needs to be, I think, like pointed out. So this is not the first time like the students protested about the quota issue. So like even like back in 2018, so the same issue was there. Like this 56% of like the entirety of like the government jobs are going to go in some sort of like quota allocation. So there was a protest, and like even back then, what the government did was just like a random like blanket decision that like all quotas are going to be abolished, and like it went on. So what people generally noticed is like this time what happened was like the decision came not from the government but from like a writ that was filed in the court. Suddenly there was like some like hearing within the court, and then the court for some reason, without much sort of like defense from the government side of it, decided like the previous decision was wrong and it needs to be brought back. So I think this is the point in time. I think that the student protest started to also realize that this is not going to be resolved like just through like a civil protest of sort, because like even from that point in time, like Awami League with a lot of different perspectives was trying to identify, and there was like some insinuation that like this is not a protest of students even to begin with. There is also like the political parties are giving some level of like fuel to like even like have this discussion about the quota issue itself. Also, what happened was like as the way that like any like regime that stays in power for way too long, I do feel like they became like way too overconfident in the way that they were engaging through the media in response to the things that they were saying. So there were a lot of different like incendiary things that they were saying. People protested legitimately, but the way that the legitimate protests were clamped down on, like there were like police having like open firing on students with lethal bullets, with like rubber bullets, and a lot of like tear shells, even though the student protesters were not doing anything. And then like the issue that Orkuta was mentioning about like suddenly the internet was cut off for everyone because like people realized that the internet was being used as like a very important like coordination tool. And that also meant that the government does not necessarily want to engage with the students at any point in time, considering the grievances were like piling up over the years for a long period of time. I think gradually it started to feel like that like we as students, even if we get some sort of like a reform for the quota issue itself, seems like that the government is always very heavy handed in the way that they're reacting. Because like if you go through the accounts of the student protesters who were like directly on the field, what they were always saying is if you always wanted to have a discussion, why did you have to open fire on protesters? Why did you have to like go through a curfew of like 3 or 4 days before suddenly saying that like discussion is always open, you can always come to like one and have a discussion with us? And that's when if you like see how the like slogans itself changed. Initially this was like we have been termed as anti-state because of the dictators are saying so. Then it started to like move into the discussions like we are not going to have a discussion on top of the bloods of the martyrs that we already have. So it changed into a discussion about like whether or not we are getting our rights, to the point that like how the government is always trying to get an upper hand by very violent means. And later on, I think like personally what I feel is like the spark in the like fire, or the last nail in the coffin that happened was the some of the like student coordinators were like very vocal and very publicly in front of the cases. Like you would see like two of them, like Nahid and Asif, are part of the advisory committee itself of the interim government. They were suddenly like picked up by the detective branch of the police without having any reason, because like people were already seeing that many of the protesters were like extrajudicially like brought into like police custody without having like any cases filed on them. And what ended up happening is like suddenly like the coordinators came on screen to media and just said like we are removing the demands that we have and like we are stopping the protest. Then people realize like this is now has become no longer an issue of getting your rights, because there is like always a sense of like duress that's happening. And that's essentially when the all the demands, like there were like in the start there was like I think like few demands, I forgot the number. When the curfew started happening, there was like 8 demands which was asking for apology from the government, not even like stepping down of any sort. Then there was this like a 9 demands which focused again on apologies and removal of like vice chancellors of universities, which sparked the general protest, or like justice for the ones that has died, and court proceedings happening on people who have shot fire, like fired onto these protesters. So even then, it was not a demand after the government stepping down. But when people realized that it's the government that is always trying to utilize all the like entrenched strengths, even like what Mubarak mentions, is like even in like administration, judiciary, law enforcement, the way that they had like infiltrated their power to the extent that they were always using all of these means, essentially ended up giving this indication that like the Sheikh Hasina-led government is never going to give any tangible change of rights. It's always going to be some sort of like an eyewash of a solution, then saying that we were always in your favor. And then that's the point in time where it became like significantly political in nature, essentially because people just realized that like without having this government not being in power, most likely we would not be able to get anything, even if we get like a quota reform now. So even like just like it feels hilarious because like even during the protests were happening, people were saying that it's very hilarious that people are having to protest for their right to meritocracy, their right to safe road, or like their right to like having like just like generally like education that's not having any like VATs imposed on them. So all the things that are supposed to be like very like basic rights for people, they had to protest to make sure that the government is not having any infringement on that. And that's the point in time I feel like it became very political in nature, essentially because I think this generation just like felt fed up that like, yes, like I personally feel like I could have like done more in my like earlier age, but I feel like these generation just decided like let's do it, and like we are just going to like get this government down because it's not making any sense, because like we go to road, there is some solution, then like every like few other years it becomes a challenge. The other portion about like influence, I think like this is always going to be like quite a speculative thing, because like I personally feel the way that the people supported the movement as it transitioned from a like quota issue to an anti-government thing, the way that like people like celebrated, yes, I would say like I would agree with Laura that the way that people went slightly, I would say like crazy in the way that they were celebrating, to the extent that it became like very like problematic in nature in the way that the optics was presented. But as you see, like the fact that like when you see like mindless joy being there, you would realize that the level of like so the level of like anguish that these people were feeling were generally like bursting out at that point in time. So the reason that I'm speculative is like, as Ahmed was mentioning, like Bangladesh has been an economic like power in the last few years. There is a lot of like geopolitical benefits of having ties with the country. Even if in the worst case scenario for our country's future, there were like some influence from like different countries, I would say like on net that most likely would have negated it out, because like for the last 15 years, like India was a very strong ally with the country. I would rather say like was a strong ally with the political party who was ruling in this country. So I would say like even if there were like influences that most have like that should have been negated out in the way that the thing was playing out. But like from my like own like first-hand account, I would say uh the amount of joy that I saw in like the people, like people were just like randomly like going to the streets and celebrating on 5th of August, to the extent that I would say like even if there were like any influence, I don't think like that had any tipping point or like tipping power to whatever that like people were feeling, to the extent that like it would have happened one way or other. Like even if it's not 5th, I think like someday in the next few weeks it would have happened eventually, because like people are getting just like absolutely fed up. So yes, I do feel like the people of the country did enough to, I think, like get the win for themselves, I think, at this discussion.
I may step in.
Yes, Mubarak, if you can respond to that with your points. You had some points with regards to how India weighs in and all, and then I would request Ahmed to respond to that. And then finally, we'll have Orgo, and then we'll wrap it up and hand it over to Rahul to close the proceedings. Yes, Mubarak, if you can bring in your points and then Ahmed responds.
Sure. I think the first thing is notice the Indian media, and it's not just the right wing. A lot of opposition members like Shashi Tharoor as well talking about the potential influence of Pakistani, influence in the Bangladesh uprisings and so on and so forth. I think fairly, to be honest, overcredits Pakistan's intelligence abilities at the moment, but also diminishes the grassroots-based movement that has happened in Bangladesh. I think India needs to come to reconcile with the reality that this is a people-based movement and very much popular support has removed Hasina from power. The other thing is who is committing some of this communal violence, as Kharge pointed out, is largely speculative. But nonetheless, definitely there is a contributing factor to some of these negative perceptions about, that some of these Hindu people were, supporting Hasina, therefore some level of, sort of like revenge, communal violence occurring. And I'm not going to deny that that is definitely part of the picture. But at the same time, a potential part of the picture is a part of the Awami League people who have been removed from power, also spiking up communal violence in an effort to kind of like cause unrest that potentially shows that we need them and potentially trying to lay the foundations for their return, which are all part of the picture. And again, it's quite speculative to figure out who is responsible for what extent of the violence. But my point is that firstly, that this is largely grassroots based, and secondly, which brings me on to the point of India, is I think that if any foreign entity has played a large part, India has played the largest part so far. And probably what I would say is like it should start being an ally to the people of Bangladesh as opposed to the government that was in place in Bangladesh. And I think it will find it a lot more fruitful. The good thing is a lot of the things that they have done with Hasina is transferable, right? So let me just finish the first point first about violence, because when the Indian media is hyper speculating, so for example, there are elements of fake news, right? Like Litan Das, the Indian, like the Bangladeshi Hindu cricketer's house was supposedly burned down, and then BBC fact checks that this is not true. For instance, just to name one of another temple being burned down, but actually the flame was from a building behind the temple, which is an Awami League's office. So there's just a couple of instances of potential unverified news being propagated in the Indian media, for example. Fanning the flames for this kind of narrative, if anything, creates potentially more anti-India sentiment within the Bangladeshi population, and potentially even fuel some of the sectarian violence that the Indian population is, the Indian government is supposedly so keen on reducing. So which brings me to the Indian government, which is that the Indian government does not have to be so partisan in its attitude towards the Bangladeshi government, because Bangladesh ultimately would benefit largely from having good trade relations with India. There might be some level of political posturing. Let's say, BNP comes to power, they might demand that, Sheikh Hasina come back to face trials, knowing that India probably won't listen to those demands. But ultimately, when you come to the substance of things in terms of actual trade between India and Bangladesh, most of those things like bus routes, train routes, you talk about power deals and so on and so forth. Those things are largely things that are transferable from regime to regime. Like those are trade relations that can exist in a positive way between India and Bangladesh. I don't think that's a place of concern. Perhaps things like some things may have to be relooked at, such as the Tista, water issue. Thankfully, something that has reduced a little bit nowadays, but nonetheless, the BSF killing issues on the borders. These are things that perhaps a new government might try to renegotiate with the Indian government. But none of these are things that are completely unworkable, though perhaps Mamata Banerjee would disagree. But these are things that I think the Indian government is very much capable of keeping positive relations with Bangladesh, as long as it is willing to kind of not so much posture to domestic politics through, like spiking up some of the sectarian news agendas and so on and so forth, but rather looking at how to establish proper relationships with the Bangladeshi people. I think that would be the best way forward, but maybe that's a factory.
Ahmed, can you respond to that?
Yes, I was just waiting to comment. So you see, as far as the foreign influence question is concerned, we agree or know for a fact that it is largely speculation in nature. Like I said in my opening remarks, right, you need to understand that this is a civilian uprising. This is not a military coup that has taken place against the government. So we understand, and this is something that I've harped on from the beginning. Like in pre-90s, you had military coups in Bangladesh, but this is not like that. Which is why I said that there's a room for cautious optimism over here because this is a civilian uprising. But let me tell you why the speculation in India has gained ground that there might have been a foreign hand. And again, I completely admit it is speculation. And I, for one, will not give much importance to this speculation because I have literally seen videos on Facebook where people have assembled in large numbers singing Dono Dhane Pushpe Bora. I mean, is Amar Dhanmo Bhumi. I mean, literally seeing the celebration on the road. So I don't think that a foreign hand might have had a very big influence, maybe a catalyst here and there. But let me tell you where the speculation is coming from. So the first speculation that's come where, and our External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, has actually said in Parliament that these are just speculative in nature and they are still investigating on it. Like we don't have any confirmation on it. This is something which has been said on the floor of our Parliament. Now there are two reasons. The first thing is that Sheikh Hasina from January had been alleging that America had been trying to influence the election and they were wanting to influence the outcome. This is the first speculation that came from there. And the second speculation that came from there was reports emerging not just in the Indian media, but also in sections of the foreign media that Tariq Rahman, the son of the BNP chief, had actually met the ISI in Dubai to create a sort of scenario where Bangladesh would lead to an overthrow of the government. Now, I know for a fact that the ISI does not have that amount of influence in Bangladesh, but there were reports coming that may have led to this speculation coming through. So I, for one, will not attach great importance to it because I know for a fact that this is a civilian uprising. You see, the High Court verdict came out on 5th June and the overthrow of this government was on 5th August. So there were 2 months in between. The Sheikh Hasina government would actually have engaged in deep negotiation with the student leaders right in the month of June, which would not have led to so much of conflict within Bangladesh. That is something that you have to concede. Right. And there were bullets, there were videos in which a 4-year-old kid who was actually sitting on the balcony had been shot dead by the police just because they'd come out to see. So there were horrific videos that were coming out. So just to dismiss it as like a foreign hand or a conspiracy, I think that is not even something that India is doing. India recognizes the will of the civilian people, which has led to the overthrow of this government. And that is why the High Commissioner of India in Bangladesh was a part of the swearing in ceremony of the interim government in Bangladesh. So I think let's keep that to speculation and maybe a little bit of a catalyst here and there. Because you see, whenever there is a civilian uprising, the nature of a civilian uprising is that there will always be a handful of anti-social elements who will try to put their agenda behind it. So you saw these elements here and there, attacking the Hindu community, breaking down the statues of Bangabandhu, attacking, Indian businesses, Indian garment businesses in a large number of factories that are in Bangladesh. So I would still say this was a section of it, and not really. It would be wrong to dismiss the civilian uprising as something that was created by a foreign government. So for my end, I'm very clear on that part. That little bit here and there could have been possible, but this is a civilian uprising that has led to the overthrow of this government. Secondly, coming to about the India being identified with Sheikh Hasina, sections in India have actually recognized that this was a miscommunication on India's part. You see, the ties between India and Bangladesh are not because of Sheikh Hasina. The ties between India and Bangladesh are civilizational, are historic. There is a shared struggle for the Bengali language, which is why you have Bhasha Divas being celebrated in India as well, right? So there is a deep history that is involved, and Rabindranath Tagore wrote the national anthem both for Bangladesh as well as for India. So it would be wrong to say that only Sheikh Hasina is responsible for it. But I will concede that the Indian government was forced into agreeing to Sheikh Hasina's policies because of what had happened during Khalida Zia's regime from 2001 to 2006. And you see, when we were growing up, and I'm sure that maybe Sovik sir must have seen that when we were growing up, we would often see incidents where those people who were carrying out their criminal activities in India were actually given a safe shelter in Bangladesh when Khalida Zia was the prime minister. So there was a perception going on over here that you can actually do whatever you want in India, but you will go and get patronage with Khalida Zia or safety in Khalida Zia's land. And so when Sheikh Hasina came to power, it was sort of like a policy compulsion, I would say, on the Indian perspective, that you had to support Sheikh Hasina because she was agreeing to crack down on these anti-India elements as well as on those elements who were going to attack or create extremism in Bangladesh, which would have a ripple effect on India. You see, anything that happens in Bangladesh is going to have a ripple effect in Indian society. So it was more of a policy compulsion. But I agree that the mistake was that we should not have gotten identified with a political party. And that is something that Indian policy quarters are right now discussing in great detail. We have to be identified with the people of Bangladesh. We right now are in a very positive influence within Bangladesh because of the large scale of activities that have taken place over these past 15 years and because of the historical linkages that we have. So it would be beneficial, I think, both for the countries, both India and Bangladesh, to build on this from here, to expand this. Obviously, there are issues. That issues are always there between neighbors, always there between brothers, as Muhammad Yunus calls it. You can always work on it and resolve it. There is nothing to my end which cannot be worked out, and the Indian government is looking positively from what we are reading over here to working closely with the new government in Bangladesh and to develop closer ties with the people of Bangladesh. However, there are some concerns that have to be noted. The most critical aspect is the issue of security, right? You see, if there are, let's say, attacks on minorities in Bangladesh, you will see them trying to flee into India. You see, when Khaleda Zia was Prime Minister between 2001 to 2006, there were actually clashes between the BSF and the BDR on the international border. So once these things started stabilizing, which was why India went to support Sheikh Hasina. So as long as there is safety and security in Bangladesh, as long as we see peace and tranquility on the borders, I think more or less India would be, fairly. You see, a stable Bangladesh is going to be a stable South Asia. So India is going to be willing to work with any government which is there in Bangladesh, which has popular support and which is democratic in nature. Secondly, another very important point which I talk about civilian uprising, like I talked about elections, right? This started as a students' movement, but it became a channel for people's oppression or their suppressed emotions to come out, and which is why this happened. So, having said that, yeah, I mean, so I think there are few points of concern. One of the things that people, the moment Sheikh Hasina sort of fled, the people in India had two or three concerns. The first concern, obviously, was like there were days when H.M. Irshad was the military dictator. At that time, there was some anti-India element. So as long as that is taken care of, more or less, India should not be having a problem. But yes, I think we have a room for cautious optimism. Again, I will be very short again in saying that foreign influence was largely speculative. We agree with that. It's a civilian uprising, maybe a foreign hand here and there, and India would be looking to develop closer ties with the civilization of Bangladesh, and hopefully we'll have more good relations with them. So I think, yeah, I agree with a large number of things of what Bharat said as well as what Adel Bhai said to that end.
If I may pitch in for just 20 or 30 seconds, I would largely agree, and I also agree that Sheikh Hasina played a big role in, helping with the security concerns. Not to mention a lot of the earlier economic development. Perhaps the criticism would be that those were not equitably or equally shared. The one thing that I would say is, I think India can play a proactive role in terms of ensuring that those security issues don't flare up, as opposed to saying, we will wait to see if you can make sure your security happens and then react accordingly. Because if you look at the situation, right, I don't think India has much of a choice other than to end up giving some level of asylum to Hasina unless she manages to leave. But there is control over what Hasina does while staying in India. So if India becomes this place from where Sheikh Hasina can, keep on creating political strife in Bangladesh, that becomes a problem as well. So the conditions of her asylum is something that is in India's control, and to what extent it wants to proactively remain partisan in its approach is within the control of the government of India, I think. So that's something that where they can be a little bit proactive as the days come by to ensure that there is a smoother transition in relations between India and Bangladesh. Yeah.
I think, yeah, I also agree with Bharat on that end. And, as of now, we really don't know what the future of Sheikh Hasina is going to be, because from what the External Affairs Minister of India has said, she wanted a short-term stay in India. So obviously, there's something we have to see how things go on from here, which will obviously be, but I am pretty confident that from now on, and it's always been the case, the Indian government has always been pro-Bangladesh. It's just that the miscommunication happened in such a way that people have started associating India with Sheikh Hasina because of our own policy compulsions. But yes, like I said, there's room for cautious optimism, and hopefully we can play a proactive and constructive and cooperative role with the new government of Bangladesh and the people over there.
Yes, now I'll request Orgo to kind of chip in with his points before I hand it over to Rahul for the closing remarks.
So I think the first idea that I would want to sort of focus on is, was this certain fall of government something imminent? From my personal opinion, I think it was like a ticking time bomb, because when there is certain degree of oppression, suppression, inability to express your points of view, to the extent where at every point of time the country is plagued with corruption, it had to happen eventually. Whether it happened on 5th of August, in my opinion, was just on depending on the timeline as to when it would happen. And in terms of it having any influence from externals, as said by all the members of the panel, it's speculative, because every time in any movement happens, because this is not the first movement in Bangladesh that has happened in the last, let's say, 20, 25 years. Since its independence, there have been multiple movements that happen, at times for safety of roads, at times for giving priority to merit as the foremost priority. So it's not something that is new. But why, at this point of time, after 15 years of governing the country under such atrocity, and then coming in for a fourth time, I think the people had enough. And that is when it sort of triggered a point of time where people were not asking for anything else, but only one demand, that was for the government to fall and for the leader to flee the country. And to that point, it was being pushed. And from this point onward, I think the speculation of whether there were other externals involved or not, it could be, it could not be. Again, so much of information is available there, to the point where they say, it's US's fault when they want the St. Martin's Island for their, and every country has their own benefits in mind and have their own agendas. But we have to also understand that for every country's internal affairs, they need to make sure that it is mutually beneficial. And I'm pretty certain that the interim government would again take steps and measures that is again transparent, and that is known to the public to the maximum possible, or at an optimal level, that makes people rest assured that whatever is being done is for the welfare of the people, because that is what the people have shed their blood for. Or if that is not done by the interim government, then again it would probably end up being a failure as well. So this is the challenge that the interim government has to sort of overcome, where they're able to gain the trust of the people and then move towards becoming more of a stable country. Or else the entire Bangladesh has been known to give so many martyrs. All their bloodshed would simply go in vain if this particular achievement of the trust of the people is not acquired. Secondly, I think in terms of the meddling in elections, again, these are accusations that even happens in Canada as well, where it's said the Chinese government has had a role in terms of the Chinese elections, the Canadian elections. So these sort of accusations, allegations are always there. I think again, it falls on to the leadership of the countries to make sure, or sort of make their population sort of gain the confidence that no, that is not the case, and they are working for the sake of the well-being of the people. I think that particular narrative has to be showcased by the government so that the people can now trust them, because everything that has happened, the domino effect is attributed to the fact that people did not have adequate trust. And when they were being denied, or when they were given false promises, it came to a point where they said, oh no, these are only false promises. We do not trust you. The only way we can gain our confidence is by going off the power and giving the leadership to someone else whom we can trust, whom we can look up to. And I think that probably is a triggering factor for the government to have fallen out of its proportion. In terms of the anti-India narrative, in anti-China narrative, there are different ways in which countries have to collaborate. And as I said earlier, that you cannot choose your neighbors. So when you have your neighbors, it is important geopolitically and economically as well to have trades, because they are your trading partners as well. And I think India being a bigger country in terms of population and as an economic powerhouse, it is imperative for them to put forward this sense of collaboration that gives trust to the interim government and the people as well, because there is a sentiment in people to what degree can the Indian government be trusted as well. And I don't think that the Indian media has done a decent job in terms of indicating that all the information that they are spreading is true, and they have lost credibility at times as well. So again, it is imperative for the media to make sure that whatever information that they're sharing is credible and it is dependable for the public as well. In terms of the expats, right, the people who live outside the country, we do not ask for anything else other than this belief that the people back home, our parents back home, are safe. And if that particular confidence is given to us, I think we're more than happy. We do not want the government to give us anything in return. What we just want is to give in this assurance that when our parents or when our families and relatives go outside the house, they are not going to be attacked because of their religious identity or just because they belong to a different political ideological party. It should always be, as a Bangladeshi citizen, they are given the rights that they deserve fundamentally, and that should be the foundational component for the new interim government who are trying to lead the people as they're going ahead. So for us to move forward, I think it's important to gain the stability for the interim government to make sure that the people feel safe. Yes, there have been certain instances. It is also important for the law enforcement agencies to make sure that these individuals are given the deterrence for their actions, because that has also been something that has been lacking in our country back in the times where people for their actions were not held accountable. People used to get away by doing atrocities. So when they are being held accountable, when they are given punishment for their actions, I think again that will help not only the people in Bangladesh, for outsiders as well who are not living in the country, to be rest assured that yes, if people are committing heinous acts, they are being held accountable and they are being punished for that action. That will create this sense of security, this sense of feeling safe in that country as well, because we want to live in a peaceful country, and who doesn't want peace to be there? And for that to sustain as well, I think it's important for us to make sure that we are bringing them the justice and we're making sure that they are punished for their acts. So ultimately, the sectarianism that is always going to be there, but how do we move away from there is reliant on us to make sure to give this sense of confidence that every Bangladeshi citizen or every Indian citizen, that there is a sense of collaboration, and there should not be this hatred that we are trying to spread, thinking that okay, this particular government is in our favor, so that's why we favor them, and this particular government or this particular political party is going to act against us. This speculation is only going to make us propagate the idea of fear mongering, which is not going to help the cause of any of the governments or for the people as well. Because we as individuals want to only make sure that yes, whatever is being given to us is given in an honest manner and the integrity is being prevailed, and making sure that okay, these people are on the lookout for us. They're not only going there to show that they're protecting, but at the back of their mind they have any ulterior motive. So if that is the case, they should also be brought to justice and make sure that they are held accountable in that regard as well. So I think that's only way how we can move forward from the position that we are into. Yes, it's a new sort of feeling for us. Yes, it's a new beginning for us as well, but how we take it forward is something that we need to sort of decide for ourselves, where there is reconciliation and there is mutual benefits for the major stakeholders that are involved.
So, in fact, we had a very fruitful discussion from different dimensions and perspectives, and many issues uh, in terms of what we are seeing being in Bangladesh and what we are getting to see from outside the state. Those were also dealt with. Now I'll hand it over to Rahul, who has